Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a mystery that has literally frustrated every single one of us at some point. We are breaking down the anatomy of giving up and uncovering exactly why we tend to abandon hard pursuits, usually right before we cross the finish line. Let's get into it.
So why do we give up right before we succeed? You know the feeling. You start a new business, a fitness routine, maybe a creative project, and you've got massive enthusiasm. But a few weeks in, progress is painfully slow. Self-doubt creeps in, you start comparing yourself to people who seem to be crushing it effortlessly, and suddenly, the fire just dies. But here's what you really need to know right out of the gate. Quitting early is almost never about a lack of intelligence or talent. As the research shows, quitting is a universal psychological hurdle. It's basically a systemic failure to understand how progress actually works.
To understand progress, we've got to look at the number 101. Think about the classic metaphor of the stonecutter. A stonecutter stands in front of a massive rock, swinging a hammer at it 100 times. And for those first 100 strikes, there's absolutely no visible dent, not even a tiny crack. But on the 101st strike, the stone splits completely in half. Now, everyone watching from the outside celebrates that 101st hit, because hey, it looks like a sudden miraculous breakthrough, right? But the reality is that the 100 hits before it were what actually broke the rock. Consistent effort isn't wasted just because progress is invisible. It's simply being stored.
This perfectly sets up a concept highlighted by author James Clear. He points out that complaining about a lack of success despite your hard work is kind of like complaining about an ice cube not melting as you heat it from 25 to 31 degrees. All the visible action happens at 32 degrees. This is the plateau of latent potential. The results we want from our work are almost always massively delayed. We put in the energy, but we just haven't crossed that melting point yet.
The reason this delay hurts so much is because we have this fundamentally flawed expectation of linear progress. We think, okay, if I put in 1 unit of effort, I should immediately see 1 unit of reward. But the biological and strategic reality of the universe is that most outcomes follow nonlinear curves. The pain and the effort, those are heavily front-loaded, but the rewards and those sweet compounding benefits are heavily backloaded. We usually quit because we're judging our overall trajectory by immediate, short-term results.
Part 1. Your brain on the dip. The science of quitting. Let's see what's actually happening in our heads here.
So across human evolution, discomfort kept us alive, usually because it signaled physical danger. Today, when a task becomes challenging, our brain still instinctively slams the brakes and shifts into self-preservation mode. We experience slow progress and totally mislabel that friction as proof of failure. But we've got to radically reframe this. Those periods where it seems like absolutely nothing is working, they are not red flags. Mental fatigue, physical fatigue, or just a lack of immediate rewards, these are simply neutral signals that your nervous system is doing its job and actually expanding its capacity.
Part 2. The 2/3 effect. The danger of the middle.
If you break down the timeline of any major goal, there's a highly dangerous phase that trips up almost everyone. It's not the start, and it's not the end. It's the middle. Psychologists call the surge of energy we get at the end of a project the goal gradient effect. Basically, we naturally try harder when a visible finish line is right in front of us. But long before we get there, around the 2/3 mark, we hit this brutal phase known as the gray zone of conviction. This is where motivation totally collapses. The starting excitement is gone, but the finish line is still way too far away to pull you forward. The work becomes familiar, boring, and invisible. We don't actually run out of energy here. We succumb to entropy. Our brain just runs out of a compelling narrative to keep us going.
Part 3. The dip versus the cul-de-sac. Knowing when to quit.
Because let's be real, not everything is actually worth finishing. Author Seth Godin has a brilliant framework for this. The crucial point is learning to distinguish between a temporary dip, which you absolutely must fight through, and a permanent dead end, which you need to run away from. When you're evaluating your path, you're usually in one of two scenarios. The dip is a temporary struggle, where progress stalls before you reach mastery. Think of a grueling medical residency, or an entrepreneur's early years with zero traction, or an athlete spending months refining one tiny mechanical flaw in their swing. Winners actively seek out dips because the reward on the other side is massive. But the cul-de-sac? That's literally French for dead end. It's a situation where no amount of effort will ever lead to a breakthrough, like a startup in a dying industry or an investor pouring money into a fundamentally flawed asset. Successful creators, entrepreneurs, and investors don't just endure dips, they aggressively cut ties with cul-de-sacs to redirect their resources.
And this brings up a critical tension. Psychologist Angela Duckworth famously coined the concept of grit, passion and perseverance for long-term goals.
But grit has a very dark twin, the sunk cost fallacy. This is the irrational cognitive bias where we keep pouring time and money into a failing project just because we've already invested so much into it. Blindly persisting in a cul-de-sac isn't grit at all. It's an escalation of commitment driven entirely by the fear of admitting we were wrong.
So we really have to unlearn this idea that quitting is always a moral failure. There is a massive difference between strategic quitting and emotional quitting. Strategic quitting is a logical evaluation of your future potential and your opportunity costs. It's looking at the hard data and realizing, hey, my ladder is leaned against the wrong wall. Emotional quitting, on the other hand, is just a panicked reaction to temporary discomfort, boredom, or the fact that no one is praising you right now. You should never ever quit in the dip just because it hurts.
Part 4, Engineering Unstoppable Momentum. Surviving Flat Seasons. Let's get into the practical side.
Since we've diagnosed the problem and mapped out the traps, how do we actually survive those flat seasons where nothing seems to work? Entrepreneur Joel Brown has a great insight here. Motivation is an emotion. Momentum is a system. When the fire dies in the middle of your project, it's usually because you've been running on temporary emotions. We watch a motivational video, feel a massive spike of dopamine, and try to surf that wave. But emotions are fleeting by design. Highly successful people rely on reliable systems. Consistency matters so much more than motivation.
Here's the exact framework to build that system. Step 1. Shrink the game down to the tiniest possible action. If you're writing a book and hitting a wall, just write one single paragraph. If you want to get in shape, just do one push-up. You want to make the barrier to entry so ridiculously small that failing to do it feels absurd. Step 2. Track the streak, not the results. Since results are heavily delayed, tracking your daily habits gives your brain the immediate micro-wins it desperately craves. Just marking an X on a calendar keeps the momentum alive. And step 3, change your environment. Sometimes your brain just needs fresh inputs, like moving to a different room or working from a new coffee shop, just to snap out of a procrastination pattern.
There's actually some amazing hard science backing up why streak tracking works so well. Researchers at MIT implanted tiny carbon fiber electrodes into the brains of rats to continuously measure their dopamine levels. They used a really sophisticated technique called fast-scan cyclic voltammetry, and the results were eye-opening. Dopamine didn't just spike when the final reward was given. Instead, dopamine levels increased steadily as the animals successfully navigated closer and closer to their goal. By tracking your streak and creating visual interim milestones, you are literally hacking your brain's chemistry. You're giving yourself a sustained motivational drive, even if the final goal is still years away.
Look, it is incredibly tempting to only stare at the peak, focusing entirely on the falling confetti or that massive final payoff. But extraordinary results come from ordinary actions performed consistently over time, especially during those long stretches when the connection between your effort and your success is completely invisible. You have to learn to fall in love with the process of climbing those intermediary steps rather than just obsessing over the summit.
Ultimately, surviving the dip requires a profound identity shift. You cannot wait for success to arrive before you change how you see yourself. If you view yourself as just an amateur trying to write a book, you're going to quit the second it gets hard. But if you decide your identity is a writer, then sitting down to type is just what you do, regardless of how you feel that day. You have to decide who you are and start acting like that successful version of yourself, long before the external evidence shows up. By doing that, you essentially force the world to eventually bend in your favor.
I want to leave you with this final, powerful thought. When the frustration is peaking, when the work feels totally invisible, and you're deeply tempted to just walk away, remember the stonecutter. Ask yourself, are you truly in a dead end, or are you just one strike away from shattering the stone? Because the hardest moment to continue is often the moment right before a breakthrough.